Recently, I was talking to somebody from a Bible college and they said, we've just switched over to the natural language approach and students are loving it. They sit down in their breaks and they talk to each other in Greek or Hebrew or whatever it happens to be. And I said to him, so what's the plan for helping your students to learn to study the Bible? And he didn't have an answer to that. And here's the thing, if all you do is learn to read the text or converse in the text, you're going to really struggle when it comes to actually studying the Greek New Testament or the Hebrew Old Testament. Before you start learning Greek, you have to have a pretty decent idea of where you're going and what your goals are. The failure to know where you're going and to identify your goals as you start the task of learning Greek will invariably, very often learn people to actually fall into one of two different errors. And so in this video, we're going to talk about what those two errors are, how to avoid them, both of them, by making the correct choice as you, or at least thinking through things from the correct point of view as you begin your journey to learn Greek, or in this case, this applies to both Greek and Hebrew together. Hi, I'm Daryl Burling from Biblical Mastery Academy, here to help you with small, consistent steps to be able to master the entire New Testament and Old Testament in the original languages. As we get started, the first error to avoid then is the error of learning to do exegesis or learning Greek or Hebrew so that you can do exegesis but not learning to read at the same time. Many seminaries, when you go to seminary, this is the approach they take. They want you to learn to be able to exegete the text, and so they're going to take a very heavy, grammatically oriented approach to learning the language, and you're never actually going to learn how to read the text because that's not their intention. Their intention is that you can pick the text apart, understand what the author's intent is by doing so, and that's really all you need to be able to do exegesis. In my opinion, this is a major mistake, and I'm going to give you 4 reasons why I think this is a critical mistake to avoid. The first one is, and perhaps most obviously, this is an unnatural approach or an artificial approach to the language. It's very unlikely that when your wife speaks to you or your husband speaks to you or whatever it happens to be, that you sit there and pull apart and identify what the verb is and what the nouns are and whether they're the subject or the object and what's modifying what. You're very unlikely to actually sit there and do that. Take an email, for instance, from somebody. You just don't do that. Nobody actually does this in real life. So if that's all we're doing with the language, then we're actually not treating the language as a real living organic language. We're actually treating it as just purely a group of elements of text put together, which our job is to unscramble, de-revel, if you like, and unpuzzle our way through this piece of text. This is not how we normally approach language, and it shouldn't be how we approach the Word of God either. Now, certainly, we want the ability to identify nuance, to identify and clarify ambiguity, and to be able to think through that, and certainly grammar will very much help us to do that. However, if all we can do is just work with the language by breaking it into these tiny little components, we've really missed the point of what language is intended to do. The second thing that happens as a result of this even is that we often will miss the author's flow in the text. This is actually one of the reasons why I believe the translators of the New American Standard Bible back in the early 70s took this passage in Galatians chapter 3, and in verse 15 it says to Abraham and to his seed, and then in verse 29 it talks about you are the descendant of Abraham. It's the same Greek word in both of those, but because they were thinking through the text in this kind of atomized kind of way, they missed the connection between the same word in the two texts, and they translated the second one in a different way entirely. Now, I could be wrong. It could be a different reason they did that, but it strikes me as one of those things that you miss the flow of the author's arguments because you're actually breaking it into these small little chunks and then you're trying to translate it accordingly. And I don't think that's a great way to actually work with the text, and I think that's one of the mistakes we see sometimes with some of the ways that texts and commentaries and whatnot sometimes are treated. There are many times when, as you read through the Greek text or the Hebrew text for that matter, you start to see the same root being used for adjectives or adverbs or nouns or verbs. And you see the author using these roots consistently throughout the text. But of course, in English, you don't have the same adverb may not have the same root in English as it does with as the verb that you're using to translate that same word, because the languages just work differently. And as a result of that, you completely miss all these connections throughout the text as a result. And so you really want to be able to treat the text as a whole, to flow your way all the way through it by reading it organically, rather than just sort of picking at it and pulling apart passage, maybe a few verses at a time, just so that you can do your sermon preparation. You really want to be able to read the text fully in the original language before you get anywhere near the exegetical process. A third reason that I think this grammar-only approach and this exegesis-only approach is a mistake is that it leads to a very poor knowledge of the languages. Typically, people who finish maybe even 4 semesters of Greek in seminary have such a poor understanding of the Greek or the Hebrew that they've just spent all those semesters learning that they actually don't have the confidence or even the desire to continue to use the language. And as a result of this, therefore, they actually won't be inclined to actually use it. And that leads to another problem which follows out of this, and that is a very rapid erosion of that knowledge. And I think the reason that people lose their Greek in seminary is not so much because the method is poorly taught or anything like that, but because these students are never taught to know the language well enough to use it properly and therefore to keep it. And so as a result of that, they don't keep it. Because if you're not using it because it's too hard and you don't understand it, you don't have enough knowledge of it, you're just not going to use it. And if you don't use it, you're not going to develop it. If you don't develop it, you're going to lose it. So you need to have enough of a knowledge of the language to be able to use it effectively, to read the text fluently, to be able to then study the text in depth and then continue to develop it by continuing to learn more vocabulary, by continuing to learn to read greater varieties of texts in the same language, be it, if it's Greek, it's Septuagint text or Apostolic Fathers text or even harder texts inside the Greek New Testament. There's plenty of stuff to learn and plenty of ways to develop, but only if you actually learn to use the language properly. So my recommendation is don't learn to do just the exegesis, just the grammar. You really need to take your knowledge of the language much further. You really need to be able to learn to read the text. But this is not the only error to avoid. And I see people on the other side saying, well, I don't want to go down that track. I don't want to commit that error. And so they go to the other side and they actually don't learn the grammar at all. If you're finding this video and this content helpful, then it's possible that we can help you go even deeper, regardless of where you are in your knowledge of Greek and Hebrew. If you go to bma.to/get started, we have a quiz there which will ask you just a handful of questions, and at the end of those questions it will give you 2 options to take your next best step forward to being able to read and study the Bible in the original languages without tools, without having to depend on readers' editions and so on and so forth. And of course, if you don't want to learn Greek, we've also got recommendations in this for you there as well. So bma.to/get started, whatever level you're at, this will give you your next best step to get into learning to study and read the New Testament in the original languages. Let's get back to it. Recently, I was talking to somebody from a Bible college and they said, we've just switched over to the natural language approach and students are loving it. They sit down in their breaks and they talk to each other in Greek or Hebrew or whatever it happens to be. And I said to him, so what's the plan for helping your students to learn to study the Bible? And he didn't have an answer to that. And here's the thing. If all you do is learn to read the text or converse in the text, you're going to really struggle when it comes to actually studying the Greek New Testament or the Hebrew Old Testament. To me, this kind of seems obvious. One of the main reasons that anybody learns either Greek or Hebrew is so that you can read and study the Bible. As Christians, this is why we learn Kine. I mean, why else would we learn a language nobody today speaks if it wasn't for the fact that there's all these texts written in it that we want to read? So what's the value of learning to do all of this work if we can never actually study the text the way we want to? And for hundreds of years, scholars have been talking about the way the text is written using the language of grammar. because the grammar works as a language of language, if you like. It describes and defines and explains the way words are being used together so that we can then understand that together. And if we never learn the grammar, then we're never going to be able to use those resources, understand their arguments, and work with them. Now, you might think, well, surely if I learn to read the text, or even speak the text for that matter, I can learn the grammar later on. Well, you'd think so. But here's the thing. If you never learnt grammar while you knew English, what's the chance that you're going to do so after you've learnt Greek or Hebrew? My experience is that those who learn to read or even converse in Greek and Hebrew will never learn the grammar if they've never not learnt it as they were going through and learning it to start with, because again, it's just another thing to learn, and it requires you to go all the way back to the very basics of the language, which you feel you've now gone way beyond because of course you can speak it or read it or whatever. And so why would you ever go backwards again? And so for most people, I don't think this is really a viable option. It's more likely you'll just never learn the grammar, and as a result of that, your knowledge of and your ability to study the text of the New Testament or the Old Testament using these grammatical concepts will never be something that you can do. Now, I'm sure that there are people out there who have actually gone and done it this way, and if that's the case, leave a comment below, let me know how you did it. I'm really interested. But for the most part, that's what my experience has been with people who have learnt using a natural language approach or a reading first approach without actually learning the grammar. The second thing that often comes with this is what we call imported assumptions. And that is that we assume that the way language works in English is similar to the way it works in Greek. And that means then that we sort of don't really take into account the nuances of, say, the Greek or the Hebrew language. Now, with Hebrew, this is perhaps less of an issue than it is with Greek because Hebrew word order is a lot more fixed than it is in Greek. But let's say, for instance, you learn how to speak in Greek, but you just work at it from an English point of view. If you've never learnt an inflected language and you're coming at it and it's a dead language, it's going to be very difficult for you to really be able to grasp how to use changing word order, for instance, to make your points more emphatic or certain or clarify things in certain ways. But yet we see that the New Testament authors and other authors outside of the New Testament during the Kenny period are doing exactly this. They are changing word order in very specific ways because that suits their purposes. But if we are never actually taught how the grammar works and we assume that it's working just like the way we work in English, then we're importing assumptions into the way the text work, and we're going to make mistakes in our understanding of the author's intent. Finally, as I sort of alluded to earlier on, if we learn to read the text but not study the text, not the grammar that goes with it, we're going to be limited in the tools that we can use. Now this means then that some of those more technical tools like advanced grammars and advanced technical commentaries, for instance, if we don't actually know the grammar, we're not going to be able to follow the arguments that the authors are making. And as a result of that, when we look at the two different commentators and they make arguments using the grammar and they do so and come to different conclusions, we aren't in a position where we can actually adjudicate between those two things because we don't understand what they're talking about. And so one of the reasons for learning Greek and Hebrew for that matter, and learning the grammar that sits in behind it and learning how the language actually works is so that we can see the tools and what commentators over thousands of years have said about the way the language is working. Well, hundreds of years, perhaps more than thousands, but to see the distinctions in how the language is working and how, say, a genitive or an indicative verb might happen to be used in any given context and what the implications may be for the authorial intent of that text. Unless we can do that, we're really kind of just going to be left to sort of say, well, these two guys disagree and I don't understand why. And as a result of that, we're no better off than if we'd not learnt the language in the first place. So my encouragement is that there is a better way, and this is what we do in Biblical Mastery Academy. We teach you both to read and study the text of the New Testament and the Hebrew of the Old Testament as well. We'll teach you the grammar, we'll teach it to you in a way that is easy to grasp, and at the same time, we will teach you to read the New Testament or the Old Testament in the original languages as well. But I'd love to hear from you. As you're thinking about learning Greek or Hebrew, or if you've already learned about Greek and Hebrew, let me know in the comment section below, which of these methods do you kind of have you sort of thought about what was your goal as you started getting into this? I'd love to hear from you in the comments, so let us know down there. If you are interested in learning Greek or Hebrew, take the quiz at bma.to/get started. We'd love to help you get underway with your training in the original languages so that you're able to read and study the original texts of the Bible for yourself. Thanks so much for watching. Keep taking small, consistent steps toward mastery, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video. We'll see you then.